Bigfoot in Appalachia was the excuse, hatred was the cause, and what happened in those mountains during the winter of 1973 was never meant to be remembered. What you're about to hear should not be in this video. There are stories buried beneath the soil of this nation that were never meant to surface, truths so uncomfortable that entire communities agreed to forget them, documents that were misfiled on purpose, testimonies that were recorded once and then sealed away in county archives where no one would ever look. The Appalachian Mountains hold more than fog and folklore. They hold silence, the kind of silence that follows tragedy, the kind that protects the guilty and abandons the dead. In the early months of 1973, something happened in a remote hollow of eastern Kentucky that would never appear in any newspaper, never be discussed in any courtroom, and never be acknowledged by the families who still live on that land today. What began as whispered rumors of a creature in the woods became an excuse for violence that had been waiting for generations to erupt. The people who disappeared were not taken by any beast. They were taken by neighbors, by men who had known them for years, by hands that had shared meals and tools and church pews. And when it was over, the entire region agreed to blame something that did not exist, because the truth was far worse than any monster. You are about to hear the full account of what happened in Marrow Hollow, a place that no longer appears on any official map. You will learn what was done in the name of fear, what was justified in the name of protection, and what was buried so deep that even the earth has tried to forget. By the end of this story, you will understand why no one ever speaks of it. You will understand why the survivors moved away and changed their names, and you will understand why the real danger in Appalachia was never hiding in the trees. It was sitting at the dinner table. It was standing in the church aisle. It was watching from behind every window. Stay until the very last moment, because what was hidden for 50 years will finally be spoken aloud. And once you hear it, you will never see these mountains the same way again. The winter of 1973 arrived early in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. By the second week of November, snow had already blanketed the ridges and sealed the narrow roads that connected the small communities scattered across the hollows. In places like Marrow Hollow, isolation was not a seasonal inconvenience. It was a way of life. The people who lived there had done so for generations. Their families had carved farms out of the wilderness in the 1800s, survived the coal boom and its collapse, and learned to depend on no one but themselves. They trusted their neighbors only because they had no other choice, and they trusted outsiders not at all. Marrow Hollow was not a town in any official sense. There was no post office, no general store, no gas station. It was simply a cluster of about 40 homes spread across a narrow valley, connected by dirt roads and footpaths that wound through the forest. The nearest real town was Adkins Creek, nearly 15 miles to the west, and even that was little more than a few buildings and a single stoplight. People in Marrow Hollow grew their own food, hunted their own meat, and handled their own problems. The sheriff's office in Adkins Creek rarely visited. When it did, it was usually to collect a body. The Holcomb family had lived in Marrow Hollow longer than almost anyone else. Walter Holcomb, 63 years old in 1973, was considered the unofficial leader of the community. He owned the largest piece of land, employed several local men during planting and harvest seasons, and had a voice that carried weight in every decision that affected the hollow. His word was not law, but it was close. People came to him with disputes, with concerns, with fears. And in the fall of 1972, they came to him with something else. Stories. The stories began in late September. A farmer named Dale Sizemore claimed he had seen something moving through the trees at the edge of his property just before dawn. He described it as large, dark, and walking upright. He said it moved too fast to be a bear and too quietly to be a man. He told his wife first, then his brother, and within a week the story had spread to every home in the hollow. Most people dismissed it. Dale Sizemore was known to drink, and his eyesight had been failing for years. But then other reports followed. A woman named Opal Branham said she heard something circling her cabin at night, something heavy that breathed loudly and scratched at the walls. Her husband found deep marks in the wood the next morning, marks that looked like they had been made by claws. A teenager named Curtis Prater said he saw a tall figure standing at the edge of the forest while he was walking home from a neighbor's house. He ran the rest of the way without looking back. By October, nearly a dozen people had reported seeing or hearing something strange, and by November, the word had a name: Bigfoot, the creature of folklore, the monster of the mountains. Some people laughed at the idea, others did not. In Appalachia, belief in the unexplained ran deep. These were communities where people still told stories of haints and witches, where old women read signs in the clouds and men carried charms in their pockets to ward off bad luck. The idea that something ancient and unknown lived in the forest was not absurd to them. It was simply another part of the world they had always known. Walter Holcomb was not a superstitious man. He had lived in those mountains his entire life and had never seen anything he could not explain. But he was also a practical man, and he understood that fear, whether justified or not, could tear a community apart. So he listened. He gathered the reports. He walked the edges of the forest himself, looking for tracks, for signs, for anything that might explain what people were seeing. He found nothing, but the fear continued to grow. By the time the first heavy snow fell in November, Marrow Hollow had changed. People no longer walked alone after dark. Families kept their children close. Men began carrying weapons, not just for hunting, but for protection. The nightly gatherings that had once filled the hollow with laughter and music stopped. Windows were shuttered early, doors were barred, and in the silence that followed, something else began to take shape, something far more dangerous than any creature in the woods. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, do it now, because what comes next is the kind of story that disappears if no one is paying attention, and this one has been disappearing for 50 years. The Denton family arrived in Marrow Hollow in the spring of 1971. Marcus Denton was a former coal miner from West Virginia who had moved his wife Clara and their 3 children to Kentucky in search of cheaper land and a quieter life. He bought a small plot on the eastern edge of the hollow, near the base of the ridge, and built a modest cabin with his own hands. He was a hard worker, quiet and reserved, and he kept mostly to himself. His children attended the small schoolhouse in Adkins Creek, and his wife occasionally traded vegetables with the women of the hollow. But the Dentons never fully belonged. Part of it was timing. They were newcomers in a place where families had lived for over a century. Part of it was geography. Their land was on the edge, separated from the rest of the community by a narrow creek and a thick stand of pine trees. But there was something else, too, something unspoken. The Dentons were different. Their skin was darker, their accents were unfamiliar. And in a place where sameness was safety, difference was threat. No one said anything openly. There were no confrontations, no hostile words. But there were glances. There were silences. There were doors that did not open when the Dentons knocked. Marcus felt it, Clara felt it, and their children, especially their eldest son, 14-year-old Jonah, felt it most of all. He had tried to make friends at school, but the other children kept their distance. He had tried to help with the harvest at the Holcomb farm, but he was always given the worst jobs and the smallest share. He learned, slowly and painfully, that he would never be one of them. When the creature sightings began, Marcus Denton paid little attention. He had more pressing concerns: a roof that leaked, a well that was running dry, a family that was struggling to survive its second winter in an unforgiving land. but he noticed that the sightings always seemed to happen near his property. The forest, where the creature was supposedly seen, bordered his land. The scratches on Opal Branham's cabin were on the side facing his direction. The tall figure Curtis Prater saw had been standing near the tree line that marked the edge of Marcus's plot. He did not understand what it meant. Not yet. The first real accusation came in late November. A man named Harlan Couch, who lived about half a mile from the Denton property, claimed that something had broken into his smokehouse and taken several pounds of cured meat. He said he had found large footprints in the snow leading away from the building and into the forest. The footprints, he said, were not human. They were too large, too deep, and too wide. He told everyone who would listen that the creature had finally come for their food and that it would come for them next. Walter Holcomb examined the tracks himself. He saw what Harlan saw, large impressions in the snow, roughly the size and shape of a man's foot, but wider and deeper. He followed them into the forest for nearly a quarter mile before they disappeared into rocky ground. He returned with no answers, only more questions. But when he asked Harlan if he had seen anything else, Harlan hesitated. Then he said something that would change everything. He said he had seen a figure leaving the smokehouse, a dark figure, a figure that walked upright and moved quickly into the trees. He could not see its face. He could not see its features. But he was certain, absolutely certain, that it was not human. The word spread within hours. By nightfall, every family in Marrow Hollow had heard the story, and by the next morning, the story had grown. The creature was not just stealing food. It was hunting. It was watching. It was waiting. Some people said it had been seen near the schoolhouse. Others said it had been heard howling on the ridge. A woman claimed it had looked through her window in the middle of the night, its eyes glowing in the darkness. None of these reports could be verified, but none of them needed to be. Fear does not require proof. Marcus Denton heard the rumors like everyone else, but he heard something else too. He heard his name, not spoken directly, not in accusations, but in whispers, in the way people looked at him when he walked past, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. He began to notice that the creature sightings always seemed to happen near his land. He began to notice that the descriptions of the figure, dark, tall, moving quickly, matched descriptions that could just as easily describe him. He went to Walter Holcomb. He stood on the porch of the Holcomb farmhouse and asked, plainly and directly, if people were blaming him for what was happening. Holcomb did not answer right away. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, then said that people were scared, that fear made them see things that were not there, and that the best thing Marcus could do was stay close to home until the situation calmed down. He did not deny the accusation. He did not defend Marcus. He simply told him to disappear. Marcus returned to his cabin that night with a weight in his chest that he could not name. He told Clara what had happened. She listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fire. When he finished, she said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew what was coming. They had seen it before, in other places, in other times. The pattern was always the same. First the fear, then the blame, then the violence, and then the silence. The children were asleep, the fire was dying, and outside, the snow continued to fall. December arrived with a cold so bitter that the creek froze solid, and the trees cracked in the night. The people of Marrow Hollow stayed indoors as much as possible, venturing out only to tend to livestock or gather firewood. The creature sightings continued, though less frequently now. Some people believed the cold had driven it deeper into the mountains. Others believed it was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension in the hollow had not eased. If anything, it had intensified. The isolation of winter made everything worse. Families that had always been close began to argue. Neighbors who had shared resources for years now hoarded them, and the whispers about the Denton family grew louder, more persistent, more specific. A meeting was held at the Holcomb farmhouse on the evening of December 9th. Nearly every adult in the Hollow attended. The purpose, according to Walter Holcomb, was to discuss the situation and decide what to do. But the real purpose was something else entirely. It was a trial without a courtroom, a verdict without evidence, a sentence without appeal. The accusations began almost immediately. Harlan Couch stood up and repeated his story about the smokehouse, adding new details that he had not mentioned before. He said the figure he saw had been wearing clothes, not fur. He said it had moved like a man, not a beast. He said he believed the creature was not a creature at all, but a man pretending to be one. And then he pointed to the east, toward the Denton property, and said everyone knew who lived there. Others followed. The woman who claimed the creature had looked through her window now said she had seen it walking toward the Denton cabin. The teenager who had seen the figure in the forest now said it had been standing on Denton land. A man whose chickens had gone missing said he had found feathers near the creek that separated his property from Marcus's. One by one, the accusations piled up, each one more specific, each one more damning, each one pointing in the same direction. Marcus Denton was not at the meeting. He had not been invited, but he heard about it the next morning when a group of men came to his cabin and told him he had until sundown to leave. He stood in the doorway, his breath visible in the cold air, and looked at the faces of the men who had come to deliver the message. He recognized all of them. He had worked beside some of them. He had shared meals with others. And now they stood before him with weapons in their hands and hatred in their eyes, telling him that he and his family were no longer welcome in the place they had called home for nearly 2 years. He asked what evidence they had. They said the evidence was clear. He asked for a chance to defend himself. They said there was nothing to defend. He asked what would happen if he refused to leave. They said nothing. They did not need to. Clara appeared behind him, her hand on his arm. The children were inside, watching through the window. Marcus looked at his wife, then at the men, then at the mountains that surrounded them on every side. He had nowhere to go. He had no money to start over. He had a family that depended on him and a world that had already decided he was guilty. He told them he would not leave. Pause here. Think about what you have heard. If this story is affecting you, leave a comment saying, "Some monsters never lived in the forest," because by the end of this, you will understand exactly what that means. The men returned that evening. There were more of them this time, nearly 20, carrying torches and weapons. Walter Holcomb was at the front, his face unreadable in the flickering light. He called out to Marcus, told him this was his last chance, told him that what happened next would be on his own head. Marcus stood on his porch with a rifle in his hands. Clara was inside with the children, huddled in the back room, their faces pale with terror. He knew he could not fight 20 men. He knew he could not win. But he also knew that running would not save them. It would only delay the inevitable. What happened next was recorded in no official document, no police report, no court record, no newspaper article. The only accounts that survive are fragments, whispered stories passed down through generations, half-remembered details shared in confidence, and a single journal entry written by a woman named Ruth Holcomb, Walter's sister, who watched from her window and wrote down what she saw. Ruth Holcomb was 58 years old in December of 1973. She had never married, never left the Hollow, and never spoken against her brother in her entire life. But what she witnessed on the night of December 10th changed something inside her. She could not stop it. She could not intervene, but she could write. And so she did, in a leather-bound journal that would remain hidden in her attic for nearly 4 decades, until it was discovered by a relative cleaning out her home after her passing in 2011. Her account is the only surviving first-hand record of what happened that night. It is incomplete, fragmented, and written in the trembling hand of a woman who was clearly in shock. But it is enough. It is more than enough. She wrote that the men surrounded the cabin just after dark. She wrote that Marcus Denton came out onto the porch and spoke to them, his voice calm, his rifle held at his side. She wrote that Walter raised his hand and the men fell silent. And then Walter spoke. He told Marcus that the community had decided. He told him that the creature in the woods had been traced to his land, that the thefts and the sightings and the fear were all connected to him, and that the people of Marrow Hollow would not live in terror any longer. He told him that he had 1 hour to take his family and leave, or they would be removed by force. Marcus asked where he was supposed to go. The roads were impassable. The nearest town was 15 miles away. His children were young. His wife was ill. Leaving in the middle of winter, in the middle of the night, with no supplies and no destination, was not exile. It was a death sentence. Walter said nothing. Marcus lowered his rifle. He turned to go inside, to gather his family, to try to survive what could not be survived. And that was when someone threw the first torch. Ruth did not see who threw it. She did not know if it was intentional or accidental, if it was a signal or a mistake. But she saw it land on the roof of the Denton cabin, saw the flames catch in the dry wood, saw the fire begin to spread. And she saw Marcus turn back, his face illuminated in the orange light, his eyes wide with a terror that she would never forget. Clara came out of the cabin with the children, all 3 of them clinging to her, their faces streaked with tears. Marcus ran to them, pulled them away from the burning building, tried to shield them from the men who were closing in. He shouted something, words that Ruth could not hear over the roar of the flames. And then the men moved forward. Ruth stopped writing at this point. The next several pages of her journal are blank. When her account resumes, it is 2 days later, and her handwriting is different, smaller, more controlled. She wrote only this: "The snow fell for 3 days and covered everything. No one spoke of what happened. No one ever would. The Denton family was never seen again." In the weeks that followed, the people of Marrow Hollow returned to their routines as if nothing had happened. The creature sightings stopped. The thefts stopped. The fear that had gripped the community for months seemed to evaporate overnight. Some people said the creature had been driven away. Others said it had been killed. A few said it had never existed at all, that it had been a mass hallucination brought on by the long winter and the isolation. No one mentioned the Dentons. The cabin on the eastern edge of the hollow burned to the ground. The snow covered the ashes. By spring, the land had been absorbed into the Holcomb. Property and the path that had once led to the Denton home was overgrown with weeds. The children who had attended school in Adkins Creek were simply gone, their names erased from the records, their seats filled by others. The teachers did not ask questions. The parents did not offer answers. In March of 1974, a county surveyor passing through the area stopped at the Holcomb farm to ask about property lines. He mentioned that his map showed a parcel on the eastern edge of the hollow that did not match any current records. Walter Holcomb told him it was a clerical error, that the land had always belonged to his family, and that there had never been anyone living there. The surveyor made a note and moved on. In June of that year, a journalist from a newspaper in Lexington visited Adkins Creek to write a story about Bigfoot sightings in Appalachia. He had heard rumors of encounters in the area and wanted to interview witnesses. He spoke to several people in town, but no one would talk to him about Marrow Hollow. When he tried to drive out to the hollow himself, he found the road blocked by a fallen tree. A local man told him the road had been closed for months and there was nothing out there worth seeing anyway. The journalist wrote his article without mentioning Marrow Hollow. The story ran on page 7 of the Sunday edition and was forgotten within a week. Years passed. Decades. The people who had been present on the night of December 10th, 1973, grew old and died, one by one, taking their secrets with them. Their children inherited the land, the silence, and the unspoken agreement that some things were better left buried. The younger generations heard fragments of the story, half-truths and rumors, but they never pressed for details. They learned, as their parents had learned, that there were questions you did not ask in Marrow Hollow. By the year 2000, only 3 people who had been present that night were still alive. Walter Holcomb had died in 1989, his final years spent in a fog of dementia, occasionally mumbling about fires and snow and things that walked in the dark. Harlan Couch died in 1994, his liver destroyed by decades of drinking. Ruth Holcomb, the woman who had written the only surviving account, died in 2011 at the age of 96. Her journal was found in her attic, wrapped in cloth, hidden inside a trunk that had not been opened in years. The relative who found it was Ruth's great-niece, a woman named Sarah Combs, who had moved to Ohio years earlier and rarely visited the hollow. She read the journal over the course of a single night, her hands shaking, her coffee growing cold. And when she finished, she sat in silence for a long time, trying to understand what she had learned about the place where she had been born. Sarah Combs did not know what to do with Ruth's journal. She considered destroying it, burning it the way the Denton cabin had been burned, erasing the last evidence of what had happened. But something stopped her. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a sense of justice that had been denied for too long. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that some truths, no matter how painful, deserved to be told. She made copies of the journal and sent them to several historians who specialized in Appalachian history. Most of them did not respond. The few who did expressed skepticism. There were no corroborating records, no police reports, no death certificates. The Denton family did not appear in any census after 1970. It was as if they had never existed at all. But one historian, a professor at a small college in Virginia, took the account seriously. He had spent years studying the intersection of folklore and violence in rural America, and he recognized the pattern immediately: the creature sightings, the escalating fear, the scapegoating of outsiders, the sudden, coordinated violence followed by collective amnesia. He had seen it before, in other communities, in other eras. It was not unique to Marrow Hollow. It was a template. He traveled to eastern Kentucky in the summer of 2013 and spent 3 weeks interviewing elderly residents of the area. Most refused to speak to him. A few shared fragments of stories they had heard from their parents or grandparents, always prefaced with warnings that he should not dig too deep, that some things were better left alone, that the mountains had a way of keeping their secrets. But one man, a retired miner in his 80s who had grown up on the outskirts of Marrow Hollow, told him something he had never told anyone before. He said that his father had been one of the men who went to the Denton cabin that night. He said his father had never spoken of it directly, but that he had heard him crying in the night sometimes, calling out names that meant nothing to the family. He said his father had started drinking heavily after that winter and never stopped, and he said that just before his father died in 1991, he had grabbed his son's hand and whispered something that the son had never forgotten. He said there was no creature. There was never any creature. We made it up because we needed something to blame. And then we became the monsters ourselves. The historian published his findings in an academic journal in 2015. The article received little attention outside of specialized circles. It was not picked up by any major news outlet. It did not spark any investigation. The people of Marrow Hollow what few remained, did not acknowledge it. The Denton family remained officially non-existent, their fate unrecorded, their names unremembered. But the truth, once spoken, cannot be fully silenced. It echoes, it persists, it waits for someone to listen. The Appalachian Mountains are full of stories about creatures in the woods, monsters in the dark, things that walk on two legs and hunt in the night. Some of these stories are ancient, passed down through generations of people who lived close to the land and understood its dangers. Some of these stories are recent, born from the same fear and isolation that has always defined life in the hollows. And some of these stories, the darkest ones, are not about creatures at all. They are about us. They are about what happens when fear becomes an excuse, when suspicion becomes certainty, when the need for an enemy overwhelms the need for truth. They are about communities that sacrifice the vulnerable to protect the powerful, that invent monsters to avoid confronting their own monstrous acts. They're about the silence that follows, the generations of denial, the unspoken agreements that allow horror to be forgotten. Marcus Denton was not a monster. He was a man who wanted a better life for his family. Clara Denton was not a threat. She was a mother who tried to protect her children. Jonah, the 14-year-old who had never fit in, who had been excluded and ignored and pushed to the margins, was not dangerous. He was just a boy. They deserved to be remembered. They deserved justice, and they deserved a truth that was denied to them for 50 years. Now you know what happened in Marrow Hollow. Now you know why no one speaks of it. Now you know why the creature in the woods was never real, and why the real danger was always human. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying I watched until here so I can know who truly follows these stories. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, subscribe now so that stories like this one are never buried again. If this story moved you, leave a like. It helps more people find the truth. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Because some stories are too important to keep silent. The mountains remember, even when we choose to forget.